Well, what a joy it is to be back. I so enjoyed last week. For those of you who are here, the rich discussion time we had afterwards in the questions, and just looking over again the wisdom of God's word was a real treat and a real excitement. And I'm really looking forward to do it again. So welcome, everyone. Last week we sort of laid down the principle that the Bible has its own signature ways of thinking, ways of engaging with the world. And I call these ways figures. They're patterns and rhythms that are repeated time and again across the pages of the Bible. And the aim this week is to build on that in two ways. First of all, I want to deepen our grasp of these key figures that build what some people call a biblical worldview. But I also want to use them to begin to examine and critique our academic disciplines and our culture through the lens of the Bible, using these figures. Now, the material that I'm going to share this week comes from a longer dive into these ideas. And if you're interested in that, I'm just sharing a link there. There's a video on YouTube that sort of unpacks this a little bit more, if you'd like to go back and look at that afterwards. And essentially, we're just going to look today at one rather basic idea and tease out its implications. And that idea is that God, lo and behold, is separate from creation. Theologians have sometimes called this the creator-creature distinction. And this term, the creator-creature distinction, captures the idea that there are two, and only two, fundamental different types of existence in the universe. There's God's existence, and there's the existence of absolutely everything else apart from God. And the fundamental principle here is that God is not the same sort of thing as the universe that He's made. And theologian Cornelius Van Til puts it this way. He says that God's existence is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. But creation, by contrast, exists as derivative and finite and temporal and changeable. There's a radical distinction, in other words, between God and the universe that He's created. And Van Til had a habit of drawing this as a diagram of two circles, with God in the top circle, and then the creation dependent on God beneath him. And it's important, as we begin to come to terms with what this is and why it's significant, it's important to realize that this isn't a dualism. This is not two equal and opposite sorts of existence. Because the universe that God has created, including us, is utterly, radically dependent on God for its existence. But the opposite isn't true. God is not dependent on the universe. This is not a reversible relationship. And this creator-creature distinction, as I hope to show a little bit in this session, really sets the biblical account apart from the dominant picture of reality in our own culture, which essentially holds that there's only one sort of existence. In the famous words of Carl Sagan, the cosmos, he says, is all that is, or was, or ever will be. And this sort of view is called monism. Van Til represented it with a diagram comprising only one circle. The idea being that everything that exists for this monistic view exists in the same way. Everything is traced back to one single underlying element or principle or reality. Now, that's changed over time, what people thought it was. The ancient Greeks, the pre-Socratic philosophers, thought that it might be fire or air or water. Today, scientists might tend to think of it as matter/energy. But there's one fundamental thing that everything that exists is made out of. That's monism. Now, it's important to note, and this is really crucial for what we're going to try and grapple with, that this is not the difference between theism and atheism. It is quite possible to accommodate gods within a monistic view, as long as those gods exist in the same way that mortals exist. So, for example, ancient Greek and Roman gods can be made to conform to this monist pattern. Now, what distinguishes these two ways of thinking about reality is not the difference between theism and atheism. It's the difference between whether the gods or the ultimate principle of reality or whatever there is part of the universe, part of the same reality as us, and therefore reliant upon the universe, or whether God is not part of the universe and therefore independent of it. But this is not a theology seminar. It's a seminar about trying to understand our academic disciplines and our culture in the light of the gospel. So we are well within our rights to be asking, what does all this have to do with culture and society? And, well, not to put too fine a point on it, what I hope to be able to show something of in the coming minutes is that this biblical distinctive of the creator-creature distinction changes our relationship completely to reality. And it is basic to everything that Christians think about society and culture and academia and everything else. Here's one concrete example. If God is separate from the universe he's created, like the Bible claims he is, then he doesn't need that universe in order to be who he is. And he doesn't need us in order to be who he is. And this is what Paul says in his Areopagus address in Acts 17, isn't it? The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in temples built by human hands. He's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath, and in case you think he's missed anything out, and everything else. Now, God owns all the treasure in the universe, all of our time, all of our talents. He owns our very selves. He made us. Now, what could we possibly give to God that he doesn't already possess? By contrast, the Bible describes you and me and everything else in creation as utterly dependent on this God who gives us life. What do we have that he has not given us is the concomitant of what could we possibly give him that he doesn't already have. Now, contrast this view with a monistic view in which me and God and the created universe are on the same level. Everything that exists is the same, whether it's traced back to a principle of matter and energy or whatever it's traced back to. In that way of looking at things, both God and I rely on the same world. We're both needy in a fundamental way. We can come to arrangements to satisfy each other's needs. And this is how almost all religions in the world work, isn't it? Human beings are in some sort of bartering relationship with God or with the gods. First, I offer the gods something that he, she, or it desires, a sacrifice, and then I hope to receive back from the gods something as a consequence, of health or longer life or crops that grow in my fields or whatever it is. And this is a signature move, a signature figure in the way that we're using that term of almost all religions and of almost all human societies as well. And I want to give it a name just to make it visible for us. We can call this common way of relating to God or the gods an N-shaped dynamic. It's the dynamic of the business deal. First of all, I make a sacrifice to the God, I offer something, and I receive something back in exchange, whether it's my health or my crops or whatever it is that I want the God to give me. In its religious guise, this is characterized by manipulating the gods, entering into a business deal with them, giving them something they want in order to get something that I want. But it's also got a secular guise, and it's in fact the way that our society runs. It governs corporate culture. It's the logic of the contract. We enter into an agreement for mutual benefit. And in its most paroxystic form, which arguably is the form that our current society takes, it's what Michael Sandel, the philosopher, has called the marketization of society. According to Sandel, we've drifted from having a market economy to becoming market societies. And what he means by that is that increasingly for us in the modern West, everything is negotiated. Everything is bought and sold. Everything is a business deal, including love and security and identity. The things that traditionally wouldn't have been part of the market are now part of this N-shaped dynamic. So imagine a world, and it doesn't take much imagination, does it? Because it is largely our world. Imagine a world in which everything is a contract. Everything is a deal struck for mutual benefit. Our relationships with our families, our relationship with the natural environment, indeed our relationships with ourselves, are business deals, calculated to bring us benefit. Well, this idea cuts with the grain of a monist universe. You scratch my back, family, environment, myself, and I'll scratch yours. It gives a pattern of a society in which we are constantly competing for common scarce resources, whether those resources be money or prestige or love. It's an environment in which the strong can thrive and do very well, and in which those with nothing to exchange are left behind. But the Bible makes a mockery of this sort of thinking. What deal can we strike with God when he gives us everything that we have? It doesn't make sense. This doesn't compute within a biblical frame. Because the God of the Bible relates to his world and the people that he's made, not through exchange and bartering, thank goodness, but through gift and kindness. Remember Paul's language in Acts 17. God himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. He doesn't contract it out. He doesn't enter into an agreement in order to give us life. So in this picture, human beings are not some sort of cosmic wheeler dealers in the spiritual boardroom, striking deals with the gods or with ultimate reality in order to get ahead. But we can picture people in this way of looking at the world more as joyful children on Christmas morning, receiving gifts from loving parents, with not expected to give anything in return. And this turns the N-shaped dynamic of bartering and bargaining almost literally on its head. It makes it into what we might call a U-shaped dynamic of gift and gratitude. So in this way of thinking about society and relationships, God takes the initiative. He provides for us out of his unmerited grace, and we respond with joyful and obedient thanks. And this puts the concept and the reality of the gift, not of the contract, not of the market, at the heart of the Bible's picture of reality. So again, I want to invite you to imagine a world. But this time, imagine a world in which the poor and the weak are not cast aside because they've got nothing to bring to the business deal, but they're cared for and they're honoured. God gives freely, doesn't he, to those who can't stand on their own 2 feet, who can't cut a deal with him. And we know that because that's us. And this gives a pattern for society, the most basic paradigm of which is not the deal, but the gift. It lays the foundation for a society of compassion, of helping the needy, even when, and perhaps especially when, they've got no means to pay back. A society of reaching out to the poor and the ungrateful when they're unable to repay or to reciprocate. It lays the foundation for a caring and compassionate society, the sort of society that I suspect we would all rather like to live in, and that we would all, perhaps more to the point, like our families to live in, especially in times when we're aware of our own frailty and our own neediness. So let me ask you, as we draw to a close, which of these societies would you prefer to live in? Which of these frameworks would you prefer to be structuring the society in which you and your family exist? One where the fundamental way we relate to ultimate reality and to each other is through contracts and exchange for mutual benefit, or one characterized through lavish generosity and compassion? Now, that's all I've got time to share today. Let me just run quickly through a brief summary of the reading material that you had for this week, just to refresh your memories. The excerpt began by saying that creation is foundational for cultural engagement. And there was a contrast drawn between Genesis 1 and other creation accounts, showing the distinctiveness of the way the Bible sets out the pattern of creation. Then the idea was introduced of God's aseity, this idea that God doesn't need us, that Paul was expounding in Acts 17. Talked about the N and the U-shaped dynamics that I've covered in this presentation as well. And then it went on to pick apart the language of Genesis 1 and to try and tease out some cultural implications of that in terms of the relationship between language and reality, in relation to the repeated phrase, and God said, the phrase that it was good in relation to the way in which modernity has stumbled over the distinction between fact and value and gets itself tied up in knots because of that. It introduced this term diagonalization and set it to work in relation to functionality and beauty. Thought a little bit about scientific investigation and order in the universe. And then dealt with this modern idea of disenchantment. We live in a disenchanted universe, suggesting, in fact, that quite the opposite is the case. And then it finished suggesting that everything within a Christian view is for Christ and what that means. So, as we split off into discussion groups in a minute, I've just really got one question for you to consider today, but it's rather a vast question, so I don't think you'll run out of things to talk about. Is this: think of one way in which the biblical doctrine of the creator-creature distinction gives you a fresh angle on the orthodoxies of your particular discipline. And let me just give you a couple of examples of what that might look like. So how would scholars in your discipline think and reason differently if they were convinced that there are actually two fundamental types of being? There's God's infinite eternal being and our finite mortal being. How might that change the way that your discipline is wired? How do the N and the U-shaped dynamics play themselves out in your discipline? Do the norms of your discipline content, in other words, the way people talk and write about what your discipline studies, match the way in which the discipline itself operates? In other words, how the scholars relate to each other. Do people walk the walk in your discipline, will be another way of saying that. And finally, what would your discipline look like if it were redesigned from the ground up, beginning with the creator-creature distinction?